With its granite domes, towering waterfalls, and giant sequoias, Yosemite National Park attracts millions of visitors every year. But if the U.S. government had not taken steps to conserve this scenic wonder during the darkest days of the Civil War, Yosemite could have ended up in private hands, inaccessible to all except its wealthy owners. This unprecedented federal act of public park making, the first such instance in history, rested on a novel belief: that it is the responsibility of a Republican government to preserve and maintain places of great natural beauty for the well-being of its citizens. In his 1865 Yosemite Report, the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted explained why. It is a scientific fact that the occasional contemplation of natural scenes is favorable to the health and vigor of men. Olmsted concluded, the establishment by government of great public grounds for the free enjoyment of the people is thus justified and enforced as a political duty. This was the first written expression of the national park idea.
The Yosemite Report is an interesting document. It isn't very long. It's only about 20 pages or so. Olmsted saw it as an opportunity to present, if you will, a blueprint for the role parks would play in American society, in American democracy. And so it was a very forward-thinking, big vision of America through the lens of parks.
The government's preservation of Yosemite was inspired by the success of Central Park, a revolutionary public space in New York City, designed by Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, which was already attracting great numbers of visitors eager to escape the noise and chaos of the rapidly growing metropolis. Though vastly different in scale and character, both parks were an expression of a vision of government dedicated to serving the most basic needs of its citizens.
Yosemite could probably not have been envisioned without first creating Central Park. They were very connected, both in ideology, the idea that you had to create these places for all the people of the United States, but also these parks were important for the health and well-being of its people. He sees it as an essential duty of government, something on the same basis as national defense.
Before the Civil War, the federal government was small, charged with narrow responsibilities, such as pursuing escaping enslaved people. In 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Act, an unprecedented piece of legislation that granted federal land to the states to establish colleges that would advance agriculture and promote economic innovation, especially among the working classes. It was in the third and bloodiest year of the Civil War that Lincoln made the pivotal decision to preserve the Yosemite Valley for public well-being. This ongoing expansion of public benefits would lead in 1868 to the passage of the 14th Amendment, granting Black Americans citizenship and equal protection under the law.
The Lincoln administration needed to offer the people of the United States something better from their government. They were being called upon to make enormous sacrifice on the battlefield, and the country couldn't return to the status quo. A slave republic that offered few benefits to those other than the very wealthy and privileged. And so Olmsted wanted to capture the moment and make the case that in a reborn and recreated American republic, parks were a keystone element.
Olmsted was an obvious choice to create the report, not only because of his connection with Central Park, but also because he was a prominent unionist and had served as director of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, precursor of the Red Cross. As a New York Daily Times correspondent, Olmsted had written extensively about human enslavement in the antebellum American South. His landmark 1861 book, The Cotton Kingdom, expanded on these articles, offering a vivid first-hand account of the corrupting effects of slavery. Olmsted's influential book brought home the horrific conditions in which enslaved people lived. He brought the same passion for emancipation to his Yosemite Report, envisioning the potential role of parks in a free and united, reconstructed America.
It's also not an accident that he presents this report to the party that includes the Speaker of the House of Representatives and a number of well-known journalists. Olmsted uses this opportunity to speak to the nation. And in fact, his ideas are picked up by several in that group. And then Olmsted decides to come back east and rejoin Vaux, who's just landed the commission to design Prospect Park in the city of Brooklyn.
It took several years for the national park idea to take root. The example of Yosemite, whose management was initially overseen by the state of California, influenced Congress in 1872 to establish Yellowstone as the first federally managed national park. This was followed in 1890 by the creation of Sequoia National Park and a greatly expanded Yosemite. To care for this growing system, Congress established America's National Park Service. Signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in 1916, the legislation was supported by American conservationists, reformers, and landscape architects, including Olmsted's son and successor, Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr., who wrote the National Park Service Act's Statement of Purpose.
The report influenced the development of parks in the United States in a major way, and particularly the National Park Service. There are some real parallels between some of the language in the Yosemite Report and the language creating the National Park Service. There's no accident. The first thing that just strikes you is the extensive network of pathways and roads through the park. Olmsted anticipated that what is enjoyed now by limited numbers of people will eventually be enjoyed by millions of people, and you had to prepare for that. If you can move people around and control their impact, you could both have this opportunity for personal enjoyment on an individual basis and the opportunity for this more collective experience. Circulation systems are not just about moving people through the landscape from one end to the other. It's about creating a sequence of experience. It's the contrast that makes it so exciting and so powerful. Moving through these parks, in effect, tells the story. For example, when you look at those meadows, you understand that they were not an accident of nature, but of hundreds of years of indigenous husbandry. Otherwise, it would be a forested floor.
Tribal groups who had made Yosemite their home for millennia periodically set fires to improve game habitat, increase acorn production, and keep the landscape open. In the 1850s, these indigenous inhabitants were violently displaced by state militia to create settlements for farmers and miners drawn to the west by the promise of gold and the spirit of manifest destiny. Some of these lands were eventually incorporated into the new park. Over time, the connections between national parks and Olmsted, Lincoln, Abolition, and the Civil War became obscured by fictional origin stories that took root in the National Park Service. For a time, a widely accepted myth attributed the national park idea to a campfire conversation between Western explorers on the Yellowstone Plateau. Years later, conservationists Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir were also credited with coming up with the idea, again around a campfire, though their encounter actually took place nearly 40 years after the Yosemite Report was written.
The early National Park Service really adhered to this campfire story. And one of the reasons they were probably reluctant to talk too much about Olmsted and the Yosemite Report is that Olmsted had some of the wrong associations. He was associated first and foremost with Central Park in the public's mind. And they wanted to differentiate the great Western parks from anything in the East, certainly urban parks. And also the connection back to the Lincoln administration was uncomfortable because it brought back the Civil War and the reasons why the Civil War was fought at a time where the country was in the mood for forgetting.
In their depiction of supposedly untouched wilderness, these so-called campfire tales also obscured the brutality and injustice that led to the dispossession of Indigenous people from these lands.
This was a landscape with connections to both stories, to the displacement of Indigenous people and to its connection to emancipation and all that happened associated with it. So it was a time of forgetting.
The struggle to protect great American landscapes for all people continues to this day. At a time when the ranks of the National Park Service are being decimated and the threat of selling park land and privatizing services is very real, the Yosemite Report's call for responsible stewardship and guaranteed public access to these magnificent places remains as urgent today as it was when first written.
This drive to greater equity and protection of these places and the government's obligation to continually be a good steward are as relevant and timely as ever. And so to return to this history is very appropriate, but we got to get it right. The Yosemite Report is not a document of antiquity. It's very much a document that speaks to the challenges of modern life. If we give up these places, if we don't protect them, then we'll be a much poorer country and a much weaker democracy as a result. Well, you visit Central Park today, or Yosemite for that matter, and it's almost a life-changing experience. People are moved by these places in ways that are hard to comprehend, and they form a lifetime attachment. I had the opportunity to visit Yosemite about a year ago, and I was just blown away. I was amazed by not just the number of people enjoying the park, but by the broad diversity of users. I never expected to see that in my lifetime. People from pretty much all over the world, in every demographic and every age group, they're using this park. It's just extraordinary. And I think it is a realization, finally, of Olmsted's dream.
To learn more about American landscape history, visit lalh.org.